So this afternoon we're going to talk about demystifying virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI licensing. And so before I jump into that, I'm just going to go through a couple of quick slides, and I'll keep the commercial piece of this to a minimum here. But Method 180, for those of you that don't know, I know some of you have been on our webinars before, but Method 180 is a firm that is made up of ex-Microsoft employees primarily, and our fundamental drive is to help our clients drive cost out of their contracting with Microsoft. And we sort of do that around three areas of, or there's three areas that we kind of help our clients when we do these things. The first is around what I'll call consulting services. Many of our clients put us on a retainer to help them with their various Microsoft challenges, whether it just be asking licensing questions, whether they're going through an audit, or whether they're in a negotiation with them, but they put us on a retainer to help them throughout the year with anything related to Microsoft. We have an audit assistance practice, or if you also they're an audit's cousin, the software asset management, or SAM engagement. So we help organizations assist them through doing audits with Microsoft, and focusing on driving out cost out of those audits. And then the other thing that we do is we work around contract or enterprise agreement negotiations with Microsoft. But today we're here to talk primarily about how do I license virtualized desktops. And we brought this one up today because it is something that we're seeing gaining more and more traction. I would say probably about somewhere between 70 and 80% of the clients that I'm working with nowadays have some sort of VDI infrastructure, or doing remote access to technologies, whether those are applications or whether it's desktops, into their environment. And it's an area that's growing, and it's an area where the licensing, quite frankly, is very confusing. And so today I'm going to try and clear some of that up as best as we can in 40 minutes or so here in a webinar, and I'm going to make sure I hopefully leave enough time for a couple of questions at the end. But I think the key thing is, what is a virtualized desktop, and how does that relate to licensing? So you'll hear Microsoft use the term VDI quite often. I think that's a common term across the industry. But one of the things that I tell people when it comes to Microsoft is you really want to be careful when you tell them that term VDI, because they hear that somewhere. And I got a slide I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. But they hear one thing when you say that. But there are many ways that VDI solutions can be delivered. Three of the main technologies that we see is VMware View, Citrix and Desktop, and then to some extent Microsoft AppV. And each of those are a little bit different technically, but they also have different licensing implications. So you want to be careful when you say VDI to Microsoft, because they're going to hear that one way. So I think that's one of the key things, is not only are those technologies and how you approach this different in terms of what technology does. Citrix obviously approaches it slightly different than VMware, which is different than how Microsoft approaches it, but that means different things when it comes to licensing. The other thing that I think is important, and this is one thing that not only, I shouldn't say customers get confused about this, but they're doing something, they call it VDI because they just kind of use the generic term that's out there in the industry. And there is a difference between what I'll call application streaming and VDI. So VDI, when it comes to Microsoft, when you say VDI, what that really means to Microsoft is that on some server, you are running Windows desktop OSs. Okay, so whether those are Windows 7, Windows 10, doesn't matter if it's Pro or Enterprise. In some cases, we might even see some older XP out there. But really what you're doing is you're running a virtual machine on a server that is running a Windows desktop application. Now, there are a lot of people that consider VDI to be application streaming, and that is different. And actually, application streaming is typically if you're using Citrix, and you're actually, what you're doing there is you're taking and streaming an application on a Windows Server session. Okay, so there's the fundamental difference, is that in what Microsoft considers to be VDI in their language is I'm creating a virtual machine that has a Windows desktop OS, such as Windows 10 in there, versus application streaming, where I'm streaming an application such as Office, but I'm doing that on a Windows server session, okay? And so that actually impacts the licensing. In that VDI environment where I'm doing the virtual machine, I may also have Office included in there, but how I'm delivering that is different, okay? Technically, it's different. So why are we talking about VDI today? You know, I did mention that it's out there, it's likely in your environment already, and in a lot of instances you may not know it. So when we're doing audit work, or even when we're doing EA negotiation work, a lot of the time we will you know, see a customer's inventory, and they'll tell us we're not doing any VDI, and then we'll take a look at their inventory and we'll see virtual machines that are running Windows Windows sessions. So a lot of the times it's out there, it's in the environment already, you just may not know it. So one of the use scenarios that we are seeing that is quite common, and this is one of the areas that a lot of people are looking at VDI for a solution, is for their outsourcing offshore contractor workers. So they want to give their, you know, offshore workers or their outsourced worker environment access to their systems, but they want to do that in a controlled environment. So they're using, you know, VDI or app streaming as the technology to do that. And so that's one of the areas that if you're not sure if it's being used, it's one area where you may want to consider looking to see what are we doing, you know, in this area, because that's one of the areas that IT is using because of the controls and how it allows them to lock down access to those systems. One of the things that we still see, this has been the case for 4 or 5 years, maybe even longer, is that the cost of licensing can actually make the business case for VDI not attractive. We actually see a lot of VDI projects that stall or don't, you know, get you know, moved out beyond a small group of users because of the cost of licensing. It can be very costly depending on which way you're doing VDI, and I'm going to talk about that here in a couple of seconds, to actually license these environments. The other thing is, you know, to add to the confusion, or you know, kind of how I mentioned that it is confusing, is that because the different vendors such as VMware and Citrix offer different solutions, the licensing costs differ in those scenarios. And so if you tell me that you're doing VDI with VMware, I'm going to look at that and tell you that you need a stack of licenses in order to do that, which is different than the stack of licenses that it requires to do a similar solution for Citrix. And so not only is the licensing complicated, the cost can be different vendor to vendor from a Microsoft licensing perspective. Even though you're, at the end of the day, trying to deliver the same thing to your client, the cost can be different depending on whose technology you use to run VDI. And it obviously has an impact into how you license your enterprise agreement. You know, for instance, do I need to have SA on the OS in order to get VDA rights? Should I be doing user-based licensing for Windows, which is kind of a newer offering that Microsoft has? I think it's been out for about a year now. But user-based licensing for Windows in these scenarios may make sense. It may not, but it may make sense. So, you know, you have to look at user-based licensing versus device-based licensing. You know, the impact that it has on contractors and offshore workers could be positive. We've had a scenario where a client of ours was able to reduce about $2 million of licensing by implementing a VDI solution and VDI solution for their offshore workers, and putting some language in when they were renewing their contract in around who had to provide certain licenses, but they were able to reduce the number of licenses that they had to purchase for their offshore workers, which was obviously, you know, something they were happy about. In reverse, we've seen other scenarios where clients, once we dig in and start talking to them, they're doing certain things with their offshore workers, and they're actually in a non-compliance position based on what they have. So it's very complicated. A lot of people will say, Mike, what can we do? You know, we have a VDI environment for our offshore workers. What licenses do we need? And the answer to that is really, it depends. It depends on which technology stack you're using, so Citrix versus VMware. It depends on what your contract says about who has to provide the licenses. You know, a great example is a lot of the time these are developers. And so if your contract explicitly states that they're responsible for software, then maybe you don't have to provide them licenses for MSDN, even though you might have that, or for Visual Studio and MSDN, even though you may have that in your image. But if you don't have that language, then you're at risk and exposure and would have to license it. So there's a lot that goes into just looking at how that profile for those people work. So when it comes to VDI, and if you want to really kind of peel back the layers of how licensing works, there's a couple of layers that you need to look at. So at the bottom of this slide, we have some VDI host servers, we have some Windows servers, and that is kind of called the stuff that is in the data center, so to speak. And so depending on who the host servers are, if that is VMware, there's no real impact to Microsoft. Obviously, you're going to have some VMware licensing costs, but there's no impact there from a Microsoft perspective. If that's Citrix, then that might sit on some Windows servers, so you do have some Windows server requirements there. Now, the reason that I put Windows servers beside VDI host servers in this illustration is because regardless of whose technology you're using, if they're going to start accessing virtual machines and things like that, that's going to be done through user settings in AD. And so you do have licensing concerns, not just for the server, but client access licenses and things of that nature. And so if we look at the layer above, which is kind of the virtual layer, so to speak, in the blue up there, you've got your virtual machines with the Windows Pro or Windows Enterprise, and so you've got some client OS implications for Microsoft there, and you're going to have a management infrastructure or provisioning layer. And so that could be Microsoft, that could be others, and in those virtual machines you may have applications from Microsoft that impact their licensing, such as Office, Visio, Project. You may also have access to other Microsoft servers that happen there, email, for instance, or SharePoint, so Exchange and SharePoint. So there's a lot of stuff that could come into play, but if we were just to boil it down, I'd like to start simple and then layer on complexity over time, is if we look at it from a simple perspective, we're going to look at the host servers. So where's that VDI infrastructure hosted? What's required there? Then we're going to look at the VDI layer itself, or the virtual layer itself, and see how that's being done. So if this was a Citrix example, we wouldn't see virtual machines. We would have apps being streamed there, which obviously makes it a little bit different on a Zen app scenario, not Zen desktop. Zen desktop, they do virtual machines. So earlier I was saying that what happens a lot of the time is when you say VDI to Microsoft, that means dollars to them. They just think dollar signs. And when you look at the dollar signs, a lot of the times they're wrong, because they're just going to assume the following. So if I go back and look at the hypervisor layer, they're going to assume that you need Windows Data Center and probably System Center licenses, because they're going to assume that the management layer involves some level of System Center. So they're going to tell you that you need Windows and System Center licenses for that host layer, both the VDI servers and the Windows servers. They're going to tell you that you need to have client OSs. Those OSs are going to need software assurance, or they're going to have to be VDA licenses, which are subscriptions, in order to have the rights to access that virtual machine. Nowadays, you could look at that from a Windows E3 or E5 perspective, so that's the user-based Windows stuff. You're going to require Windows user CALs. What I didn't put in here is they also are going to tell you that you require Windows RDS CALs, or I did have that. They're going to tell you that you need Windows RDS CAL. I had that down in the host server layer. And then they're going to tell you that you need Office licenses, whether that's a perpetual license with software assurance or an Office 365 E3 license. So they basically are going to start to hear all the following. They're going to look at your infrastructure, and they're basically going to tell you that you require licenses for Windows and System Center, all the client accesses for licenses for Windows and System Center, that you require an RDS CAL, that you require Windows with SA or VDA licenses, and that you require Office with SA or an Office 365 user license, and then add on Project and Visio if they're in those virtual images. And so they hear instantly 5 licenses. And as we go through this afternoon, what you're going to hear is you may not need all those licenses. You may or may not need software assurance depending on what you're doing in the scenarios. And so it is very complicated in terms of how these scenarios get licensed. So when people tell me, Mike, I'm doing VDI, I can't tell them exactly how to license it without really digging into what they're doing, because there are numerous options that are available in terms of of doing this licensing. Okay. So I talked about different VDI architectures and different vendors. I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways. I called this slide different VDI architectures, but these are different ways that you can remotely connect to servers, and I've kind of put in here the impact. Okay. So I've started at the bottom with the easiest way to do remote kind of desktop stuff and moved up into the most complex way. And you know, the cost increases as you go up the stream, so to speak. The complexity increases, but also the functionality increases. Okay, but I do see large enterprises, you know, Fortune 100 companies that do all of these. So it's not like you can't do one or the other. I've seen all these ways of doing this in enterprise customers of all shapes and sizes. Okay, and so the easiest way that you can get access to a remote desktop is through just a remote desktop connection. So in other words, on the left-hand side over here, you see what I just put as a screen. So that could be I go home, I log in through a remote desktop connection to my work PC. I then, through my work PC, get access into Exchange, SharePoint, etc., and I can use Office on my work PC. So really what's happening is as I click on my screen at home, it's just acting as a monitor. All the compute is happening on my PC at work, okay? And so in that case, if you look at it, let's assume this PC is licensed for Office, and that could be just an Office perpetual license. I own Office 2013 license. I don't have software assurance. The product terms allow for free access to utilize Office on that PC if I'm just doing a remote desktop connection. And the reason it allows for that is because if I make this simple, basically Microsoft views this PC at home as just a monitor displaying the screen sessions that are going on this PC here. And so this is the device that needs to be licensed. So in order to access Exchange or SharePoint or etc., as long as this end user is licensed with user CALs, there's no incremental licenses that are required for CALs. Now, if it was a device-based CAL model, then you would have to make an exception here and look at device-based or get a user-based CAL for this user to do this from home. But if we assume it's a user CAL, there's no license requirements from a CAL perspective, and there's no Windows OS requirement either, desktop OS, right? Because the desktop itself is licensed, and that could be just Windows Pro through OEM, by the way. Okay, so now as I move up, the next thing is a remote desktop session on a host server. So this is something like XenApp from Citrix, where basically what we're doing is on the server, we're loading Office, and it is being used there, but it's not running a Windows desktop OS. It's just a Windows server session where we're streaming the application. So in this scenario, if I go home and use my home PC, what happens is Microsoft considers this roaming because the server itself is not licensed for Office. It's this that's licensed for Office, okay? It's the desktop, my work desktop is licensed for Office. So here, my home PC, this server is not licensed, Office is running here. So that's what Microsoft determines or calls a roaming use scenario. Office run on a centralized server, so I would actually require SA on Office in order to use that on my home PC, or if it was an Office 365 E3 scenario, I could potentially use one of my 5 licenses for Office there. Now, because this is doing remote desktop sessions or RDS servers sessions, I need an RDS CAL, so that's definitely an incremental add to the scenario below. SA is an incremental add to the scenario below. But again, if we assume user CAL in this scenario, then that user CAL is does not require, we don't require any other CALs because the user CAL allows them to access from their home PC. So there's no Windows OS on the desktop required in this scenario either because we're not running a desktop OS on the virtual session, okay? So incrementally in this scenario, I need an RDS CAL, and I probably need to have software assurance on my Office or being user-based Office through Office 365. So now we're going to go up into what Microsoft believes VDI to be, and this is where we're running a virtual machine on a server. So I'm running, in this instance here, a Windows 7 virtual machine, and I'm going to say that that has Office on it. Okay, so again, because it's not the machine that's doing the compute and just displaying as a monitor, the screen changes, the server's doing the compute, Office needs to be licensed as if it's a roaming scenario. So no different than the RDS session down here. I'm going to require SA on my Office or that to be user-based Office licensing. If the user is on user CALs for Exchange, SharePoint, etc., then I can actually access my Exchange, etc. with that user CAL. There's no difference there. One of the big differences here is because I am creating that virtual machine where I'm running Windows 7 Desktop OS, now I need to be licensed to do what Microsoft calls VDA, Virtual Desktop Access. Okay, and so in order to do that, I need to have SA on my Windows Desktop OS. I need to have a VDA license either for this device to access or this user to access, or I need to have Windows user-based licenses for this user to allow them to access outside of their primary machine, okay? And in this scenario, depending on whose technology I'm using, I may or may not need an RDS CAL. In the Citrix Zen Desktop environment, it is my belief that you require an RDS CAL, but with VMware View, you do not need an RDS CAL, okay? So when in the last slide, when I said VDI equals dollars to Microsoft, what really ends up happening here is they see, if you say VDI, they're going to see this scenario, and they're going to hear that you need to have SA on Office or user-based Office through Office 365. You need to have SA on your Windows OS or VDA or user-based Windows to allow that because you're creating a VM on a server. They're going to hear that you need an RDS CAL, and so they're going to see all those licenses where the RDS CAL may not be required, right, depending on whose technology you're using. If you're doing application streaming instead of, you know, kind of what I've been calling VDI here, I may not need SA depending on what that machine is, that they're accessing from is, but it's likely. So we'll say you need SA on Office. I do need an RDS CAL, but I don't have any requirements for the Windows OS. And if I'm just doing the remote desktop connection, I really don't need any licenses probably because I own Office on this PC. Okay, so I know that is complicated, but that is how you boil VDI down if you're really looking at it. So when you're looking at trying to figure out what you're doing and which way you're doing, you really want to try and peel it back and go, okay, what are we doing? How are we accessing? Where are we accessing? And things of that nature. Okay. So I kind of went over a lot of this in some depth, but I'm going to go over it again because I think that these concepts are, you know, kind of complicated. So I am going to go over it again, and I'm going to go over each one of them just again in a little bit more detail and just a different way of looking at it so that you can kind of see through pictures how this works. Okay. So remote desktop connection is when I go home, I want to use my home PC, or I'm at, you know, someplace where there's a kiosk. This could even be my tablet if I got an iPad or Surface or whatnot. I go home, I use a remote desktop connection, I log into my work PC, and I then get access to Office on that work PC and into the backend servers, Exchange, SharePoint, etc. when I get there. Okay. So from a licensing perspective, because what's happening in this scenario is, let's just talk Office for a second. I'm running Office, I don't know, I'm creating a PowerPoint deck. That PowerPoint deck is actually being created on this PC. Office is running here, and then that translates back and just displays on the screen on my home PC or my tablet. Okay, so in this case, because Office is being run locally on the PC, and we're viewing my home PC or tablet as a screen that's just displaying mouse and keystrokes on the PC at work, I just require an Office license for the Office that's installed on my work PC. I don't have to have software assurance. I don't require anything special. My Windows license here does not require anything special on my home PC or my work PC, so I can just use Windows OEM here. If this end user is licensed with a user cal, then I can have access without any other incremental licensing costs into server technology, Exchange, SharePoint, etc. Okay? So in this scenario, Office can be licensed per device. It could be licensed per user as well if it was through Office 365, but it can be per device, and the CALs should be user-based, but I really don't have any incremental licensing requirements because I most likely have all the rights to access this already, even if I'm not in an EA. So then, remote desktop services. So this is the one where I'm coming in. We are not running virtual machines of Windows on these servers. We're just streaming the application Office here. So again, it's the same sort of scenario. The difference is here, I'm not actually accessing my PC at work. I'm actually accessing those servers. And so what do I require? I require I put a Windows Server cal here, but if they're going into Exchange and SharePoint would be here. If they have the user cal, that allows them to access the Windows Server from their home PC or from their work PC. They require an RDS cal because in this scenario, we're running a Windows session with an RDS cal on that, or we're doing remote desktop server sessions. So we require the RDS cal to access that. Office license requires software assurance because in this scenario, we're going to assume that Office is loaded on the server. They're streaming that application. And so it's required to allow, the SA is required to allow them to roam to home. Now, if this was a scenario where it's just internal that they access Office and they're not allowed to go home and access it, you wouldn't need SA because you're allowed to install it on a localized server. It's just that roaming away from your corporate-owned PCs that require it. If they had their own laptop dedicated to them and they took their laptop home and logged in, you wouldn't need SA. It's just where they're going away from your devices. So think about that. SA is required when they're accessing outside of the corporate, four walls, so to speak, on a non-corporate owned device. There is no requirements on the Windows OS on the desktop side here because they're not accessing any Windows desktop OS sessions in this scenario. Okay. So here we're going to go to the VDI scenario, and I'm just going to talk only no external use here. So this user, what I don't show on this diagram is that the Windows server is running a Windows 7 or Windows 10 virtual machine. Okay. So in this scenario, the user logs in, it's on premise, he's hitting the Windows server where that Windows VM is running, so he requires a Windows Server cal to access the Windows Server, potentially an RDS cal if he's running Citrix, and I did see WireView and Citrix different, and RDS only for Citrix and not View as a question, and yeah, that's it exactly, is that Citrix and VMware approach this slightly different. So Citrix uses the remote desktop services, and so that requires the RDS cal where VMware does not. Okay, so that's why the RDS cal requirement was Citrix but not with VMware. So it's only potentially you need a Citrix cal here. You need to have an Office license, but you don't need any the device-based licenses potentially could work here, because if he's just accessing, this person here, she's just accessing from their corporate desktop or laptop and they have a dedicated device, that dedicated device is allowed to access Office on a centralized server without incremental licensing. So it could just be device-based licensing if we're doing no external use. And they do require Windows Enterprise license with SA or the VDA license here, or sort of user-based Windows licenses as well. And the reason for that is that VM of Windows is being run on that server, of the desktop OS is being run on that server. So they require SA because SA includes the VDA license, and a VDA license is what allows access to the VM on the server. Okay, so if we layer on just a layer of complexity on top of this, this is where you get into external use. So in an external use scenario, again, I should have put a VM here to show that there's a Windows VM being used, but there's a Windows VM here. So the change internally, what ends up changing here is because I go home and I log in with my home PC or my personal iPad or whatnot, what ends up happening now is I'm going to assume user cals. So the Windows cal is still there, but it's a user cal, so I can access from any of these devices. The RDS cal is still there potentially with Citrix, and we would suggest that those are bought user cals, so you only need one for this user, not three for all the places that they're accessing. The difference now becomes that Office needs to be licensed with SA or through Office 365 for the user base to allow for that roaming scenario where they're no longer accessing just from corporate PCs. And then again, the Windows Enterprise with SA or VDA license will allow them to access this. Now, one of the changes that Microsoft has recently made is that it used to be that Windows Desktop OS had roaming as well, so you could go home and use this scenario. They've basically discontinued that, and this is where user-based Windows licensing becomes relevant, okay? Because if they're coming out into here, if their primary machine is run with Windows or licensed with Windows, Windows, and they put in a user-based license on that, then they can access through those. So when the roaming rights have disappeared, that makes this now a user-based scenario for that access from non-corporate owned assets outside of the outside of kind of the four walls of the corporation, so to speak. Okay. So I know that is very complicated. I've tried to boil it down as simple as I can in a 40-minute time period because I see that there's some questions here. I'm gonna answer some of these questions that have come up. But I've tried to make this as simple as possible. One of the things when we were putting this together, and also when we've done some of our other sessions, what we're starting to realize is that we can provide kind of a good overview of how the licensing works. What we like to do is share with you how to think about this a little bit different. How do we actually dive into it to truly understand it and to go a layer deeper? And that's tough to do within kind of an hour-long webinar. So one of the things that we're thinking of launching this year, and I'm just going to put up a poll here, but we are thinking of launching some training where we go deep and provide how to actually take a look at this, how to really dissect it, how to look at it from an audit perspective so that if you were to be audited, how do you know that you're protected? And so we are thinking of offering this year some paid training. We're not sure what the price point is yet, but we are thinking that if there's enough interest that we will start to develop this and roll it out. So it looks like about 78% of you say that you would pay for it if we did it. So I think that's definitely something that's on our roadmap to start rolling out in the very near future here. Okay. So I appreciate everybody that took the time to respond to that. So Sean, maybe if you want to just kind of, because I've been trying to watch the questions, but they're kind of scrolling by. So maybe if you want to take the time to kind of go back and just ask me those, I'll try and answer them. As always, if I don't get to your question or if it's something that's more in depth, I'm happy to have a quick call to walk through that. Okay.
Okay, great, Mike. So I guess first question we've got is, what about taking it even further into containerization using Docker? Are you familiar with Docker, Mike?
Yeah, I am. And so that kind of, so the real answer there is, again, what you want to do is, even with Docker and technologies like that, you want to kind of peel back and look at what is happening, and more importantly, who is accessing and how are they getting access to that, okay? And so what I mean by that is, again, you want to look at the technology. I believe Docker is VMware, but you want to look at the technology. You want to look at what's happening. So are we creating Windows, virtual machines that are desktop OSs on those servers? Okay, yes, we are. Now we know we need to license VDA. So then let's take a look at who's accessing, how they're accessing, how those things get moved around, what else is in there. So if there's Office in there and things like that. So that is a very complicated license scenario that we would have to ask a few questions to really dive into to kind of give any sort of real feedback on that. But yeah, it's a great question because it is where people are going. But again, I think what you want to do is peel that back. If you're looking to try and figure out how to license that internally, is just keep peeling it back to, Let's look at it simply. What is happening on the technology level? So are we offering up Windows VM? Are RDS sessions being created so that we need those RDS calls? What applications do we have in there that might have a licensing impact like Office and things like that? And then once you figure out the basis of what that is, then you really want to start to take a look at who's accessing, how are they accessing, are they our employees, are they only using corporate assets, and then layer the complexity on top. Okay.
Okay, great. We've got questions are piling up, Mike. So, what evidence can be gathered in order to demonstrate or prove application streaming is in use? And in this particular situation, the application is Epic across a healthcare-related SPLA.
Yeah, so this comes down to, you know, one of the challenges that Microsoft has in an audit, and I would actually say that it becomes an area of exposure for a lot of organizations in audit. And I'm very familiar with, you know, kind of Epic use in healthcare. We have quite a number of healthcare organizations that we work with, but you know, it's not just Epic. It's any application that's hosted in a third-party, you know, third-party data center. That is, you know, this issue comes into effect. So, you know, what ends up happening in an audit is the real question is who's responsible for having those licenses. So that's the first question I ask clients in a scenario like this where you have an application that is hosted in a third-party data center, is who's responsible for those licenses. And the answer to that, and this kind of comes to one of the sessions that we did a little while ago around cloud and you know who licenses and how does that get licensed. But the thing here is, you know, what you want to first and foremost do is look at, is it dedicated infrastructure or is it shared infrastructure? If it's shared infrastructure, then as you know, the question states is, then it's SPLA. If it's a dedicated infrastructure, you potentially can use your own licenses to do that. But in order to prove this, the way that they look at it is they're going to go in and take a look at what users have access to those servers, regardless if that's shared infrastructure and you're licensing it via SPLA, or if it's on-premise and you're licensing it. They're going to look at who has access. Okay, and that's a key thing. I've mentioned this on a couple of our webinars in the past, but again, it's a really key concept is Microsoft looks at everything from an access, not a use perspective. So if somebody has access, then Microsoft is going to determine that they have to use it. Now, the issue becomes, and when you're talking about gathering evidence, the issue becomes how do I do that? How Microsoft and their auditors start doing this, and I think this is wrong, and I think it's something that Microsoft and their auditors should stop doing, but let's talk about it, is they're going to go and take a look in probably AD and look and see who has access through whatever AD groups are published into access to that application, and then claim everybody in those AD groups require licenses. And so the only way that you can decrease that, because if you do a trust-based relationship with your Active Directory with Epic, and it publishes 100% of your user base in there, what you're going to need to do is look at the application and try and prove that use is controlled at the application level. So again, high-level answer to that question, that's one that, you know, we could go really deep on depending on what the scenario is, but I hope that answers Jeremy's question a little bit. So.
Okay, the next question, I think you may have touched on this, but why are View and Citrix different? RDS only for Citrix and not View?
Yeah, and that's really just I did kind of touch on this, but I'll just reiterate. That's really how Citrix and VMware differ in how they approach it. VMware does not leverage RDS services on a Windows server, where Citrix does. So you need it for Citrix, not for VMware.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, so Windows user license is required on VDI for external use scenarios?
So the answer to this is probably. Okay, and I say probably because it depends on where you are in your contract cycle. Okay, so Microsoft has removed roaming use rights from Windows. Okay, and they did that when they launched user-based licenses, because what they're saying is you need to have a user-based license replaces that roaming use right. And the reason that they did that, you know, I try and give them credit where they are. I don't know if it's true or not, but they say a lot of people were using roaming use rights inappropriately with the OS, and so we'll just set it aside. So the reason that I say probably to this question is the way that your enterprise agreement or your select contracts read is that they have a section in there that states what product terms or product use rights are governing your contract, and they basically state that during the term you can use the current or previous product terms or the older product use rights during the term of your contract, whichever is least restrictive. So depending on where you are in your contract cycle, you may be able to continue to use the roaming rights to cover this until your contract expires, and then on renewal, you would want to be looking at how do we do user licenses, or what's the most appropriate way to cover the external use scenarios moving forward. So again, without knowing the details, I can't give an exact answer, but the answer really is probably it depends on where you are in your cycle of your contracts, and can you leverage the old product terms where you were allowed to use the roaming rights or not. Okay.
Okay, that was great, Mike. I'll just encourage anyone, if we haven't gone deep enough in your questions, by all means, please reach out, and we'll be happy to schedule some time to go into more detail on these questions in more of a private setting. So next question is, can you address licensing needs for a contractor or a non-employee? Is that the same as VDI with external use case?
Again, this is another one that gets complicated. In short, the answer is yes. If you look at it from how they're accessing. Now, where it starts to get really complicated, not necessarily from a VDI perspective. If you got a remote contractor that's logging in and using virtual machines, what we always say is VDA is the answer to that, because you can't control, if they have their own hardware, you can't control what OS they're using to put Windows SA on top of that. So you would buy a VDA license, either device-based or user-based, depending on what makes sense for those employees. Now, where the scenarios change a little bit is depending on what you're doing exactly. It's going to depend on what you need from a CAL perspective. So, do you need Exchange CALs or SharePoint CALs from them? Could you use the external connector licenses that allow those for free in certain scenarios? And then the applications could differ as well in terms of, do you need to provide, say, Visual Studio licensing for them? Are they accessing Office and things like that? So these contractor non-employee scenarios in VDI are quite complicated in terms of the way people do them. There's no, there's no one way that people are doing it. It's not like 80% of the people give people a certain way. But the other piece of this as well is from an audit protection perspective, is that how your contract is written with your third party can make a big difference. So if you were to be audited and you cannot prove that they own licenses, Microsoft and the auditors will claim that you're responsible for those licenses, even if it's a scenario where you don't need to purchase licenses for them. So the easiest way to prove that that they're responsible or own licenses is if your contract has, some statement that states that they're responsible for all hardware and software. And even if you got a little bit more specific and put Visual Studio licenses or whatnot in there, then that protects you. So again, this is one of those complicated things. It's one of the things that when we're doing projects with our client base, that on contractors we could spend an hour just talking about how they're doing it, and just trying to dive and peel back that onion to figure it out. But hopefully that at least gives you some idea of where to start.
Thanks, Mike. Next question is, in a remote desktop scenario, are the Office RDS CALs needed for those really using Office, or for all that may have access even if they do not use it?
So it is for all that have access even if they do not use it. So when we're doing audit work, this is one of the scenarios, and Microsoft is getting much more sophisticated at this, where they're going to look at who has access to those servers. And if they have access, they're going to tell you they need to have Office and RDS CALs for all those users. And so when we're doing engagements with clients where we're doing self-assessments and doing kind of a, try and figure out if you have any risk, it's one of the areas that we definitely look at. I mean, we actually just did a project with a client where we looked at their Citrix use, which is this scenario, to try and figure out if they had any exposure. And they were shocked when we had almost an 8-figure exposure on this client, and they weren't that big. They were only about 5,000 users, but because of the way they were doing things, just had exposure everywhere. And really, what it boiled down to was they only needed a handful of people to have access. And so when we cleaned it up by telling them, create a user group within AD, lock this stuff down, then that really helps. But the way they're going to look at it is access. Who has access? What groups inside of AD are given access to those RDS servers, and all of those people need RDS CALs in Office. So the best thing you can do is lock these users down to the users that only need access to it.
Okay, the next question, I think we may have addressed this as well just through your answer, which is the office licensing need based on everyone who has access to the XenApp environment, or is it based on who has access to the applications via groups? And I think you just answered that.
Yeah, I did. So if you can control who has access via, AD groups or user groups, then that's what determines it. And so as long as you can demonstrate that in your audit, then you can control it to just who has access through the user group.
Okay. I guess we've had a lot of questions. I have one of my own, because this is one I get asked all the time, which is, how do you determine how many users or devices actually require licenses to access the VDI infrastructure? Because that's really what the crux of the matter is, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, that's where you got to really, there's a lot that goes into doing that, right? And so you got to take a look at, your Active Directory to look at who has access. It's a lot harder to do that from a device-based licensing perspective because it's hard to prove what devices actually have access to, a server, because they don't really log that all that well. So the way that they're going to audit it, and the way that Microsoft starts in an audit, is user-based is the only way to prove compliance. And so it really is a lot of hard work in terms of looking at your server environment, looking at that infrastructure, looking at who has access, digging into the logs. Depending on what tools you have in place, you can see, a lot of the times when we do audits with people, they'll say, oh, we don't do VDI. And then I'll pull up their inventory and look at it and say, well, that's funny because you have 200 VMs of Windows OS, so you're doing VDI. And then they go back and find out that, IT's piloting it or something, just didn't know about it. So, it's inside your inventory, looking at the VMs, what's in those VMs, looking at the Active Directory and the groups that are in there, and, making sure you have the right combination of tools and process to make that work for them. I am just going to put up another poll while we just answer the last of these questions, just to see what people are interested in for our next webinar that we'll do next month. And I think that we got time for a couple more questions, Sean. I think there might have been another one that just popped up.
Yeah, we've got a couple that have just popped up. But, we've been doing these webinars on a pretty regular cadence, so if we can get some feedback from folks as to what they'd like to see, we'll be happy to try to tailor things accordingly.
Okay, you want to ask that next question?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, should VMs that are VDI be included in an audit for counts of desktops and Office licenses?
So the short answer is no, right? Because a VDI itself is not licensable. It's access to the VDI, like the virtual machine. It's that access that is what is licensable. And so you really should not, like if you're doing inventory, and in inventory you see 5,000 Windows OSs, 5,000 Windows OSs are not necessarily licensable if 1,000 of those are VMs. Same with Office, because the Office and the VM that's Windows is not licensable. Now, auditors, just so you know, count those all the time. It's one of the low-hanging fruit anytime I do an audit work is, why are the VMs counted? They shouldn't be counted. So, the answer to that is no. I think.
Yeah, we've got another question here, if I may.
Yep.
Is it accurate to say if an employee has a Windows device with SA and accessing VDI, that only RDS is then needed? And then they go on to say, assuming they also have Office licenses as well, VDA not needed in this use case.
So if they're accessing a Windows VM, and I'm going to assume on the server as when they're saying VDI in this question here, you are correct that Windows device with SA is all that's needed. And the reason that VDA is not needed is the VDA license is included in SA. It's an SA benefit, so to speak. So VDA rights are included in the SA, so that's why you do not need a VDA license in that scenario. So, and the RDS cal is only required depending on which technology you're using to access the servers there. So, and I just had one last slide, just because I've actually been asked it twice this week, and once was this morning. Is that a lot of people are starting to look at hosting VDI in third-party cloud, like Amazon has their workspace and things like that. And so the very short answer to this is, if you're hosting VDI in third-party data centers, it cannot be on shared hardware. It has to be dedicated infrastructure. Microsoft does not have any licensing rights to allow you to access a VM of Windows Desktop OS that's on a shared server. Okay, so if you're doing that, And there are a number of third-party application providers that out there that are doing this, and you're actually exposing yourself from a compliance perspective if you're actually accessing those things. So that's just another little tidbit that I didn't really get into. But if you are hosting in a third-party data center, it has to be dedicated hardware if you're doing VDI, and that's where the VMs are loaded on the servers. Okay, so I think we've covered. I think we covered everything. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm sure. I know the team will follow up if there's anybody that wants to have a deeper discussion or has some questions that I wasn't able to get to. Feel free to reach out. Jay or Chris will probably reach out to you, or feel free to reach me at any of the above that I just put up there on the screen. So.
And this is Sean. Just so everyone knows, this webinar was recorded. We will be posting both the recording and the slide decks, and we'll be sending out the links to both the files and the recording in the days ahead. You'll be receiving emails with where those details are. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you very much, and thank you for your input and feedback today. Mike, did you have anything further to add?
No, I think that's great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.